When should we partake of the Lord's Supper? Acts 2 verse 42 says, "And they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and fellowship, in the breaking of bread and in prayer." In context, Luke had just finished talking about the birth of the church and the 3,000 that became Christians that day. Then he talks about how they steadfastly or continuously devoted themselves to several things, with breaking bread being one of those things. In this verse, breaking bread is referring to the Lord's Supper. So we can see that they were partaking of it often. However, we learn when they partook of it in the following verse, Acts 20, verse number 7. "Now on the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul, ready to depart the next day, spoke to them and continued his message until midnight." Some background information is needed here. Paul stayed at Troas for 7 days so he could worship with these Christians, even though he was in a hurry to make it to Jerusalem by Pentecost. We learn a couple of things about this verse. First, we learn that the disciples came together on the first day of the week to break bread. Notice no other day is given. So by example, we can know the first day of the week is the only day of the week that we should partake of the Lord's Supper. If it had been acceptable to partake of it on another day, Paul could have saved some time without having to wait around for 7 days to partake of it. Another important point is that the Lord's Supper is supposed to be taken on the first day of every week. Many denominations will only partake of it monthly, quarterly, or sometimes yearly. However, common sense tells us that every week has a first day, so we should partake of it every single week. 1 Corinthians 16 verse 2, "On the first day of the week let each one of you lay something aside, storing up as he may prosper, that there be no collection when I come." Every denomination that I know of will teach you that you must give of your means every first day of the week. In fact, the New American Standard and the English Standard Version both render the text first day of every week. And so as you think about this concept, if it's okay or you can understand that you're supposed to give on the first day of every week, then why is it so difficult to understand that we must partake of the Lord's Supper on the first day of every week? Now I want you to notice the significance of the first day of the week. Number one, Jesus rose from the dead on the first day of the week. Number two, the church began on the first day of the week. Number three, we are commanded to give on the first day of the week. And number four, by example, we are to partake of the Lord's Supper on the first day of the week. This makes it easy to see that the Lord's Supper should be taken on the first day of the week. Before we leave this section of Scripture, I want to point out that the term break bread doesn't always mean the Lord's Supper, because sometimes it can refer to a common meal. You have to look at the context to decide which is being spoken of. This confuses some people, especially since Paul uses this term both ways in the following verse. Acts 20 and verse number 7. "Now on the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul, ready to depart the next day, spoke to them and continued his message until midnight. There were many lamps in the upper room where they were gathered together. And in a window sat a certain man named Eutychus, who was sinking into a deep sleep. He was overcome by sleep, and as Paul continued speaking, he fell down from the 3rd story and was taken up dead. But Paul went down, fell on him, and embracing him said, 'Do not trouble yourself, for his life is in him.' Now when he had come up, had broken bread and eaten, and talked a long while, even till daybreak, he departed." In verse 7, we learn the purpose of the gathering was to break bread on the first day of the week. However, watch what happens after Paul goes down and brings Eutychus back to life. In verse 11, we find that only Paul breaks bread after midnight. So we have the term break bread used twice in this passage. But how do we decide if these are talking about a common meal or the Lord's Supper? Well, in verse 7, we can see this was a special gathering of Christians on the first day of the week where all of them would break bread. Since this was a worship service, it should be easy to see that this is talking about the Lord's Supper. However, in verse 11, Paul broke bread by himself. This is talking about a common meal because only Paul ate it. The word eaten is also significant as it means to taste. This word is never used to describe partaking of the Lord's Supper, but it is used to describe someone eating a common meal. Acts 10 verse 10, Luke 14, verse 24.